Richard had always believed he could spot talent from a mile away. After all, building a $200 million company didn't happen by accident. You learn to read people, to separate the genuine from the fake, the promising from the pretenders. At least that's what he told himself as he adjusted his Rolex and surveyed the crowded ballroom. The charity gala was one of those events Richard attended more out of obligation than interest. His assistant had marked it on his calendar months ago, and canceling would have looked bad. Besides, the cause was decent enough, something about funding music programs in schools. He'd written the check without thinking twice. Money wasn't an issue anymore. Time was the real currency, and he was spending it on another predictable evening of small talk and mediocre wine. The ballroom of the Grand Hotel was decorated exactly as he'd expected. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting warm light over tables draped in white cloth. Well-dressed people clustered in groups laughing at jokes that probably weren't that funny. The usual crowd, tech executives like himself, old money families, a few local politicians trying to seem charitable. Everyone playing their part in the same tired dance. Richard found his assigned table and settled into a chair that cost more than some people's monthly rent. His table mates were familiar faces from other events like this. They exchanged pleasantries about market trends and vacation homes. Someone mentioned a new restaurant in Napa. Another person complained about their contractor. The conversation flowed like lukewarm water, steady but forgettable. Dinner was served on schedule. Salmon or chicken, the eternal question. Richard chose the salmon and ate mechanically while half listening to a woman describe her recent trip to Italy. He'd been to Italy 6 times. He could have written her itinerary before she finished her first sentence. Then something shifted in the room's energy. Richard noticed the event coordinator, a nervous-looking woman with a clipboard hurrying between tables near the stage. Her smile was too tight, her movements too quick. Something was wrong. Richard watched with mild curiosity as she pulled out her phone and made a call, pressing one finger against her ear to block out the noise. Her face fell as she listened to whoever was on the other end. The entertainment hadn't shown up. Richard pieced it together from watching her panic. He'd seen this before at other events. Some musician or speaker would cancel last minute and everyone would scramble. Usually they'd fill the time with longer speeches or an impromptu auction. Not ideal, but not a disaster either. But then something unexpected happened. A young woman approached the coordinator from the side of the room. Richard noticed her because she looked so out of place. While everyone else wore designer gowns and tailored suits, she had on a jacket that had seen better days and shoes that were clean but clearly worn. Her dark hair was pulled back simply, and she carried herself with a kind of careful stillness, like someone trying not to draw attention. Richard couldn't hear their conversation from where he sat, but he could read body language. The young woman was speaking quietly, gesturing toward the grand piano that sat untouched on the stage. The coordinator looked skeptical, glancing between the woman and the piano with obvious doubt written across her face. But as the minutes ticked by and the phone stayed silent, desperation won out. The coordinator nodded, made a why not gesture with her hands and pointed toward the stage. Richard leaned over to his table mate, a venture capitalist named Tom. "Did you see that?" Tom followed his gaze. "See what?" "That woman. I think she just volunteered to play." Tom squinted toward the stage where the young woman was now walking up the steps. "Who is she?" "No idea. But look at her. She's not exactly dressed for a performance at $1,000 a plate dinner." Tom chuckled. "This should be interesting. Maybe she plays at hotels or something." Richard picked up his wine glass and sat back in his chair. Around him, other guests were noticing the unexpected addition to the evening's program. Conversations quieted as the young woman reached the piano. She didn't acknowledge the audience or make any announcement. She simply sat down on the bench, adjusted her position slightly, and looked down at the keys. $5 says she plays piano, man," Tom whispered, and a few others at the table laughed quietly. Richard felt a smile tug at his own lips. He wasn't trying to be cruel, but the situation was almost comical. Here was this clearly struggling young woman about to play for a room full of millionaires and philanthropists. At an event meant to showcase the best the city had to offer, she was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish, maybe both. He studied her more carefully now that she was in the spotlight. She looked young, probably mid-20s with a tired quality around her eyes that suggested she worked too much and slept too little. Her hands rested on her lap, and even from his table Richard could see they looked rough, not the soft hands of someone who spent their days in comfort. Part of him felt a twinge of sympathy. He remembered his own early days, back when he was scrambling to get investors to take him seriously, when he wore the same suit to every pitch meeting because it was the only good one he owned. Those days felt like a lifetime ago now, separated from his current reality by a gulf of money and success that sometimes felt unreal even to him. But sympathy didn't change the basic math of the situation. This woman was about to play piano for an audience that regularly attended the symphony, that had season tickets to the opera, that could tell a good performance from a mediocre one in the first 30 seconds. Whatever she played, it would need to be exceptional just to avoid being embarrassing. And exceptional seemed like a stretch given the circumstances. The coordinator had disappeared backstage, probably still making frantic calls to find the real entertainment. A few guests near the front were checking their phones, already bored before the music even started. Richard noticed one older gentleman lean over to his wife and say something that made her nod in a way that suggested agreement with an uncharitable observation the young woman seemed unaware of or indifferent to all the judgment floating through the room. She sat very still at the piano, her posture straight, her hands now hovering just above the keys. The pause stretched out for what felt like a long time but was probably only a few seconds. Richard found himself leaning forward slightly despite his skepticism. There was something about the way she held herself, a kind of quiet intensity that felt different from the nervousness he'd expected. The room had fallen almost completely silent now. Even the servers had stopped moving between tables, sensing that something was about to happen. Richard glanced around and saw that everyone was watching, waiting. The moment felt suspended, balanced on the edge of something. He took a sip of wine and settled deeper into his chair, preparing himself to be charitable about whatever amateur playing was about to unfold. At worst, it would be forgettable. At best, it might be competent enough to fill the time until the real entertainment arrived, or until they could move on to the speeches and the silent auction. The young woman's fingers touched the keys, and then she began to play. The first notes hit Richard like a physical force, not loud but powerful in a way that made his breath catch. This wasn't the tentative plinking of an amateur or even the competent playing of a wedding pianist. This was something else entirely. The young woman's hands moved across the keys with a speed and precision that seemed impossible. Her fingers danced and flew, pressing down with perfect timing, creating cascades of sound that filled every corner of the massive ballroom. Richard recognized the piece immediately. Rachmaninoff, one of the most technically demanding compositions ever written for piano. The kind of piece that even professional pianists approached with respect and caution, and she was playing it perfectly. Richard's wine glass stopped halfway to his lips. Around him he could feel the entire room shifting, the energy changing from polite boredom to something electric. The woman next to him who'd been describing her Italy trip had her mouth slightly open, her fork frozen above her plate. Tom had leaned forward in his chair, his earlier joke about Piano Man forgotten completely. The music built and swelled, soft passages giving way to thundering crescendos that made the crystal chandeliers seem to vibrate. The young woman's whole body moved with the music now, swaying slightly, her shoulders rising and falling. But her face remained calm, almost serene, like she'd gone somewhere else entirely, somewhere the rest of them couldn't follow. Richard had attended hundreds of concerts over the years. He had a box at the symphony. He'd flown to Vienna to hear the Philharmonic. He'd paid thousands of dollars for tickets to hear famous pianists play in prestigious concert halls. He thought he knew what great piano playing sounded like, but this was different. This wasn't just technical skill, though the technique on display was breathtaking. This was something deeper. Every note seemed to carry weight, emotion, meaning. The music told a story without words. It spoke of longing and loss, of joy and pain, of something beautiful struggling to survive in a harsh world. Richard felt his chest tighten in a way he hadn't experienced in years, maybe decades. He glanced around the room and saw his own reaction reflected on face after face. The older gentleman who'd made the snide comment earlier sat rigid in his chair, staring at the stage with an expression close to shock. A woman at the next table had tears running down her cheeks, though she didn't seem to notice or care. The servers had stopped pretending to work and stood along the walls, completely transfixed. The coordinator had emerged from backstage and stood in the wings, one hand pressed against her mouth, her clipboard dangling forgotten from her other hand. Even from across the room, Richard could see the disbelief on her face. She'd let this woman play as a desperate last resort, expecting nothing. And now she was witnessing something extraordinary. The music shifted, moving from the powerful crescendos to a softer, more delicate passage. The young woman's fingers seemed to barely touch the keys now, coaxing out notes so gentle they felt like whispers. The entire ballroom leaned in, straining to hear, afraid to breathe too loudly and miss a single sound. Richard realized his hands were gripping the edge of the table. When had that happened? He forced himself to relax, but he couldn't look away from the stage. His mind was racing, trying to understand what he was seeing. Who was this woman? Why was she here, dressed like that? Crashing a charity gala to play piano. More importantly, why wasn't she famous? Why didn't everyone know her name? The soft passage built again, growing in power and complexity. The young woman's hands moved faster, crossing over each other, stretching to reach keys at opposite ends of the piano. The music became almost violent in its intensity, angry and defiant, before resolving into something that sounded like acceptance, like peace hard won after a brutal fight. Richard felt something wet on his face and realized with shock that his eyes were watering. He hadn't cried in 15 years, not since his father's funeral. He'd trained himself not to. Emotion was a weakness in business, a vulnerability that others could exploit. But here in this ballroom, listening to this stranger play, his carefully constructed walls were crumbling. He wasn't alone. Looking around, he saw hardened business people dabbing at their eyes with napkins. He saw people holding hands, seeking connection with someone, anyone, in the face of something so beautiful it hurt. The music had stripped away all their pretense, all their careful social positioning, and left them raw and human. The piece was racing toward its conclusion now. The young woman's entire body was engaged, her arms rising and falling, her back straight and strong despite what must have been exhausting physical effort. Sweat gleamed on her forehead. Her breathing had become visible, quick and controlled, but her playing never faltered, never lost its precision or its soul. Richard thought about all the money in this room, all the combined wealth and power and influence. Millions of dollars sitting at tables, billions in total net worth scattered across the ballroom. People who could buy almost anything, who'd grown so accustomed to luxury that nothing impressed them anymore. And here was this young woman in a worn jacket, producing something that none of them could purchase, creating beauty that no amount of money could replicate. She'd given them something priceless, and she'd done it with just her hands and an instrument and whatever fire burned inside her. The final notes came like waves crashing on a shore, powerful and inevitable. The young woman's hand struck the keys with tremendous force, drawing out every ounce of sound the piano could produce. The music filled the ballroom so completely that it felt like the walls themselves were singing. And then, with one last cascading run down the keys, it was over. The silence that followed was absolute. Not a single person moved. Not a glass clinked, not a chair scraped, not a breath could be heard. The young woman sat motionless at the piano, her hands still resting on the keys, her head slightly bowed. The moment stretched and stretched, time seeming to stop entirely. Then someone started clapping. Richard realized it was him. His hands came together once, twice, and then the entire room erupted. Everyone was on their feet, applauding thunderously, some people shouting. The sound was deafening, overwhelming, a release of all the emotion the music had built up inside them. Richard clapped until his palms stung, until his arms ached. Around him, people were embracing strangers, laughing and crying at the same time. Tom was shaking his head in disbelief, saying "unbelievable" over and over. The woman who'd been to Italy was applauding so hard her jewelry rattled. The young woman stood up from the piano bench slowly, almost reluctantly, like she was leaving somewhere she didn't want to go. She turned to face the audience and gave a small, almost shy bow. The applause somehow grew even louder. Someone threw a flower toward the stage. Others followed suit until roses and orchids from the table centerpieces littered the floor around the piano. Richard studied her face and saw something that made his chest ache again. She looked grateful for the applause, yes, but also sad, like someone who knew this moment was an exception, not the rule. Like someone who'd grown used to not being seen, to not being heard, and was already preparing to go back to that invisibility. The coordinator rushed onto the stage, probably to thank her. But people from the front tables were already crowding around the stage steps, all of them wanting to meet her, to speak to her, to somehow connect with the person who'd just given them this gift. Richard remained standing at his table, still clapping, watching the scene unfold. His mind had shifted into the mode that had made him successful in business. He was analyzing, calculating, seeing patterns and possibilities. This woman had world-class talent, maybe once-in-a-generation talent. And she was here, unknown, struggling enough to crash a charity gala. Something didn't add up. And Richard had built his fortune on figuring out what didn't add up and why. He waited for the initial rush around the stage to thin out. Then he started walking forward. He needed to talk to her. He needed to understand her story. Because talent like that didn't just appear out of nowhere, and it certainly didn't go unnoticed unless something had gone terribly wrong. As he got closer, he could see her more clearly now. The exhaustion in her eyes, the defensive set of her shoulders despite the smile she was giving the people congratulating her. The way she kept glancing toward the exit, like part of her wanted to run. Richard had learned long ago that the best opportunities in life came from paying attention when everyone else was distracted. And right now everyone in this room had just witnessed something remarkable, but would probably go home, tell their friends about the amazing pianist they'd heard, and then forget about her by next week. He wasn't going to forget. He was going to find out who she was and why someone this talented was playing at charity galas she wasn't invited to. And maybe, just maybe, he was going to do something about it. Richard waited near the back of the crowd, watching as person after person approached the young woman with praise and business cards. She accepted each compliment with a polite smile, but he noticed how her responses stayed brief, almost mechanical. After 20 minutes, the crowd finally began to thin as guests returned to their tables, and the gala moved toward its scheduled speeches. The young woman gathered a small backpack from behind the stage curtain, the kind college students carried. She tucked the business cards she'd received into a side pocket without really looking at them. Richard recognized that gesture. He'd done the same thing countless times in his early days, collecting cards from people who'd promised to call but never would. He approached as she was heading toward the side exit, away from the main crowd. "Excuse me," he said, keeping his voice gentle. That was an incredible performance. She turned, and up close he could see the weariness in her face even more clearly. "Thank you," she said, already starting to move again. "Wait, please." Richard stepped slightly into her path, not blocking her but making it clear he wanted more than just a quick exchange. "I mean it. I've been to the symphony dozens of times. I've heard some of the most famous pianists in the world. What you just did up there, that was on another level entirely." Something flickered in her expression, surprise maybe, or suspicion. She'd probably heard plenty of compliments tonight but recognized that his came from actual knowledge. "That's kind of you to say. I'm Richard," he said, extending his hand. "And I'd really like to buy you dinner. Somewhere quiet where we can actually talk. You must be exhausted after that performance." She hesitated, studying him with sharp, intelligent eyes. He could see her weighing the offer, calculating risks. A wealthy stranger wanting to take her to dinner after she'd just crashed an expensive event. He didn't blame her for being cautious. "Just dinner," he added. "A conversation. You can pick the restaurant if that makes you more comfortable. Public place, lots of people around." She glanced toward the exit, then back at him. He saw the moment she made her decision. "There's a diner 2 blocks from here. Angelo's, do you know it?" Richard didn't, but he nodded. "I'll meet you there in 15 minutes. "Okay," she said, and something in her posture relaxed slightly. "But I should warn you, I'm not interested in whatever most rich guys want when they offer to buy dinner for a woman they just met." Richard couldn't help but smile at her directness. "Fair enough. I'm interested in your story. That's all." She studied him for another moment, then nodded and headed for the exit. Richard watched her go, then made his own way out through the main entrance. His tablemates tried to catch his attention as he passed, probably wanting to discuss the performance, but he waved them off with a promise to call later. Angelo's turned out to be the kind of place Richard hadn't been to in years. Final booths, laminated menus, a rotating pie case by the register. The smell of coffee and fried food hung in the air. A few other customers sat scattered around, mostly people coming off late shifts by the look of them. The young woman was already in a corner booth, her backpack on the seat beside her. Richard slid into the opposite side. A tired-looking waitress appeared almost immediately with coffee, which they both accepted. He ordered a sandwich without really caring what kind. She asked for soup and bread. "So," Richard said after the waitress left, "are you going to tell me your name? Or should I keep thinking of you as the mysterious pianist?" A small smile crossed her face, the first genuine one he'd seen. "It's Lisa, and I'm guessing you want to know why I was at that gala tonight." "That's one question, yes. Though I'm more curious about why someone with your talent isn't performing at Carnegie Hall." Lisa wrapped her hands around her coffee cup like she was trying to warm herself, even though the diner was plenty warm. "That's a longer story." "I've got time," Richard said simply. She looked at him for a long moment, seeming to make another decision. Then she started talking. "I went to Juilliard," she said. "Full scholarship. I'd been playing piano since I was 4 years old. One of those kids who was just good at it, you know? By the time I was 16, I was winning competitions, getting attention from teachers and agents. Everyone said I was going to be the next big thing." Richard listened without interrupting. He'd learned that the best way to get information was to stay quiet and let people talk. "My second year at Juilliard, I got a call from my aunt. My mom had collapsed at work. They'd found a tumor. Stage 3. Lisa's voice stayed steady, but her hands tightened on the coffee cup. "I took a leave of absence to come home and help. Just for the semester, I thought. Get her through the surgery and the first round of treatment." The waitress brought their food. Lisa stared at her soup for a moment before continuing. "But it wasn't just one semester. The treatment wasn't working like they'd hoped. She needed more surgery, then radiation, then different chemo. And the bills," she shook her head. "Insurance covered some of it, but not enough. Not even close. My dad had died when I was 10, so it was just me and her. I had an older brother, but he'd moved to Seattle and had his own family. He sent what he could, but it wasn't much." Richard found himself leaning forward, drawn into her story despite himself. "So I started working, dropped out of Juilliard to work full-time, waitressing mostly because the tips were decent. Sometimes I'd get gigs playing at hotels or restaurants, background music stuff. Nothing like what I'd been training for, but it paid." Lisa finally picked up her spoon and stirred her soup absently. "The leave of absence became permanent. I lost my scholarship. That's how it works. You can't just come back whenever you want." "How long did you take care of your mother?" Richard asked quietly. 3 years. Lisa's voice was barely above a whisper now. 3 years of working 60-hour weeks, taking her to appointments, sitting in hospitals, watching her get sicker, and then finally watching her get better. "She recovered?" "Yeah, she's in remission now. 2 years clear." Lisa smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. "She's back to work, back to her book club, back to complaining about her neighbors. It's the best thing that's ever happened." "But by then you'd lost your place in the music world," Richard said, understanding flooding through him. Lisa nodded. "I was 25. Too old for most of the young artist programs. Too unknown for the major competitions. And I'd been away from serious practice for years. My technique was still there. Muscle memory doesn't forget that easily. But the momentum was gone. The connections were gone. I'd missed my window." She finally took a bite of her soup, and Richard did the same with his sandwich, though he barely tasted it. He was too busy thinking, his mind working through possibilities. "I still play whenever I can," Lisa continued. "I've got a keyboard in my apartment. Sometimes I'll find gigs, small stuff mostly. And occasionally," she gave a slightly embarrassed smile, "occasionally I'll crash events like tonight. I know it's wrong, but I check the event calendars online, find places that might have pianos, and I just show up. Usually I just listen from the back. But when that coordinator was panicking, I thought maybe you'd get a chance to play," Richard finished. "Yeah. Stupid, probably, but I can't help it. When I see a piano just sitting there not being played, it's like something in me needs to make it sing." Richard set down his sandwich. "What you did tonight wasn't background music. That was world-class performance. You know that, right?" Lisa looked down at her soup. "I know what I used to be capable of. But that's different from what the music industry wants now. They want young prodigies or established names. There's no space for someone like me. Too old to be a discovery, too unknown to be taken seriously." "That's not entirely true," Richard said slowly, an idea forming in his mind. "What if you had backing? Financial support to re-enter the scene properly?" Lisa's expression became guarded. I'm not looking for charity. It wouldn't be charity. It would be an investment. Richard pulled out his phone and slid it across the table, showing her his Wikipedia page. I'm not just some random rich guy. I built a tech company and sold it. Now I run a foundation that supports various causes, including arts education. Lisa read the screen, her eyes widening slightly. You're that Richard, the one who sold the data security company. Guilty. He took the phone back. Look, I'm not making any promises tonight. But I know people in the music world. Critics, conductors, teachers. What if I could arrange for you to perform for them? A private concert just to get honest feedback on where you stand. And if they say I'm not good enough? Lisa asked. But he could hear hope creeping into her voice despite her attempt to sound skeptical. Then we'll know. But I don't think that's what they'll say. Richard leaned back in the booth. I think they'll say what I'm thinking right now. That you're the real thing. And that with the right support, you could have the career you should have had all along. Lisa was quiet for a long time, staring at her soup. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wet. Why would you do this? You don't know me. Because 3 hours ago I thought I knew everything about music and talent and what mattered. Richard smiled. Then you sat down at a piano and proved me completely wrong. That's worth something, maybe worth a lot. She wiped at her eyes quickly, almost angrily, like she didn't want to cry in front of him. What would you want in return? Teach, Richard said simply. Work with kids through my foundation's music program. Show them that talent and hard work matter, that even when life knocks you down, you can still make something beautiful. Lisa laughed, a sound that was half sob. That's it? Teaching? That's it. And maybe if this works out, you'll remember where you came from. You'll remember the struggle. That matters more than people think. They sat in silence for a moment, the diner's background noise filling the space between them. Finally, Lisa extended her hand across the table. Okay, she said. Let's try. Richard shook her hand, feeling the calluses on her palm, the strength in her grip. This woman had survived 3 years of hell and come out the other side still able to create beauty. He had a feeling he was about to be part of something special. The 3 weeks between the diner conversation and the private concert felt like the longest of Lisa's life. Richard had been true to his word, arranging everything with an efficiency that both impressed and terrified her. 7 music professionals would attend, people whose opinions actually mattered in the classical music world. Lisa practiced every spare moment she had. After her waitressing shifts, she'd go home to her tiny studio apartment and play her keyboard with headphones on until her fingers ached. On her days off, she'd sneak into practice rooms at the community college, bribing the janitor with coffee and pastries to look the other way. But doubt crept in during the quiet moments. What if the performance at the gala had been a fluke? What if she'd lost more of her edge than she realized? 3 years away from serious training was a lifetime in the classical music world. She'd been 22 when she left Juilliard, full of potential. Now she was 28, serving pancakes and crashing parties to play piano. The morning of the concert, Lisa woke up at 5 with her heart pounding. She'd barely slept. Her hands felt stiff and clumsy as she made coffee. What was she doing? This whole thing was crazy. Richard was probably going to realize he'd made a mistake. The music professionals would be polite but dismissive, and she'd go back to her normal life having wasted everyone's time. She almost called Richard to cancel. Twice she picked up her phone and started typing a message, but something stopped her each time. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the memory of how the music had felt flowing through her at the gala, or maybe it was just that she'd never forgive herself if she didn't try. Richard's penthouse was in one of those buildings Lisa had only seen from the outside, the kind with a doorman in a suit and marble floors in the lobby. She'd worn the nicest outfit she owned, a simple black dress she'd bought at a thrift store for auditions years ago. It still fit, barely, though it felt tighter than she remembered. The elevator ride to the top floor felt like ascending into another world. When the doors opened, Richard was waiting in the hallway with a warm smile that helped calm her nerves slightly. You look terrified, he said gently. I am terrified, Lisa admitted. Good, that means you care. He led her into the penthouse, and despite her nervousness, she couldn't help but stare. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed the entire city spread out below. The furniture looked like it belonged in a museum, and there in the center of the main room sat a concert grand piano that probably cost more than she'd earned in 10 years. That's a Steinway Model D, she whispered. moving toward it like someone approaching something sacred. I had it tuned yesterday, Richard said. Twice, actually. I wanted it perfect. Lisa ran her fingers along the polished wood, not quite touching the keys yet. This is the same model they use at Carnegie Hall. I know. Richard checked his watch. The guests will arrive in about 30 minutes. I thought you might want some time alone with it first. He left her there, disappearing into another room. Lisa stood motionless for a moment, then slowly sat down at the bench. The piano was positioned so she'd be playing with her back to the windows, facing the seating area Richard had arranged. 7 chairs sat in a semicircle, waiting for their occupants. Waiting to judge her, she placed her hands on the keys and played a few scales, warming up. The sound was incredible, rich and full and perfectly balanced. This wasn't like the slightly out-of-tune uprights she usually played, or even the decent grand piano at the gala. This instrument responded to every subtle variation in her touch, every nuance she could produce. Lisa closed her eyes and began to play Chopin, one of the nocturnes. Soft and sweet and melancholy, the music helped steady her breathing, helped quiet the panic in her chest. This was what she knew. This was who she was underneath all the fear and doubt. She was someone who could make a piano sing. She lost track of time until she heard voices in the hallway. Her hands froze on the keys. Richard appeared with the first guests, and Lisa stood up quickly, smoothing down her dress. Over the next 10 minutes, they all arrived. Richard introduced each one. Helen, a music critic for one of the major newspapers. David and Patricia, both piano instructors from the conservatory. Michael, a talent scout who discovered several now famous musicians. Robert, a conductor for the City Symphony. And 2 others whose names and titles Lisa immediately forgot because her brain was too busy screaming at her to run. They took their seats, chatting quietly among themselves. Lisa caught fragments of their conversation. Someone mentioned a recent performance at Davies Hall. Another person was complaining about funding cuts for the arts. They were relaxed, comfortable, probably curious but not expecting much. Richard had likely told them he'd found an interesting musician, nothing more. Richard caught her eye and gave her an encouraging nod. Then he took a seat off to the side, separate from the semicircle of judges. That's what they were, Lisa realized. A jury deciding her fate. She sat back down at the piano, her hands trembling slightly. The room fell quiet. 7 pairs of eyes focused on her. She could feel their skepticism, their professional distance. They'd probably been to 1,000 of these private performances. Young musicians with wealthy patrons, hoping to break into a scene that was already overcrowded with talent. Lisa took a deep breath and placed her hands on the keys. She'd planned a whole program, 3 different pieces to showcase her range. But now, sitting here with her future hanging in the balance, only one piece felt right. The same Rachmaninoff she'd played at the gala. The piece that had started all of this. Her fingers found the opening notes. And just like before, the world fell away. The fear evaporated. The doubt quieted. There was only the music and the instrument and the story she was telling through sound. She poured everything into it. All the nights working double shifts. All the hours in hospital waiting rooms. All the times she'd walked past music schools and felt her heart break. All the moments she'd thought she'd never play seriously again. Every bit of pain and hope and desperate longing went into the music. The piano responded beautifully, giving her colors and textures she could only dream about on her keyboard at home. She pushed it harder in the powerful sections, feeling the instrument's strength. She pulled back in the delicate passages, coaxing out whispers that seemed to float in the air. Somewhere in the middle of the piece, Lisa glanced up quickly and saw Helen. The newspaper critic leaned forward in her chair. The woman's expression had changed from polite interest to something else. Shock, maybe, or recognition. That glimpse gave Lisa a surge of energy. She drove into the final section with everything she had. Her whole body engaged with the music. The notes cascaded and thundered, building to the overwhelming conclusion. Her fingers flew across the keys in the final runs, hitting every note with precision and power. The last chord rang out and faded slowly in the perfect acoustics of the penthouse. Lisa sat frozen, her hands still on the keys, her breath coming hard. The silence stretched out, and with each passing second, her heart sank further. They hated it. They thought she was mediocre. This whole thing had been a terrible mistake. Then Helen stood up. And she was crying, actual tears running down her face. "Where have you been?" the critic asked, her voice breaking. Where have you been hiding? Patricia, one of the conservatory instructors, was nodding rapidly. That was extraordinary. That was... She seemed unable to find words. Michael, the talent scout, had pulled out his phone and was already making notes. David was staring at Lisa like he'd just witnessed something impossible. Robert, the conductor, had his hand pressed against his mouth, his eyes wide. Richard was smiling from his chair, but he stayed quiet, letting the professionals speak first. Helen walked closer to the piano, wiping at her eyes. I've been reviewing classical music for 23 years. I've heard every major pianist who's toured through this city. And what you just did, she shook her head. This is once-in-a-generation talent. This is the kind of playing people remember for the rest of their lives. I want to work with you, Patricia said immediately. Private instruction, no charge. Your technique is already phenomenal, but with proper coaching again, you could be unstoppable. I want you as a guest soloist, Robert added, standing up. Next season. I'm already thinking about which concerto, the Rachmaninoff, obviously. The audience would lose their minds. Lisa felt dizzy. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be real. She looked at Richard, who was grinning now, and he just nodded as if to say, I told you so. Michael approached with his phone. I need your contact information. I have 3 venues that would book you immediately, and I know a recording producer who needs to hear you play. The next hour passed in a blur. All 7 professionals crowded around her, talking over each other, making offers and suggestions. Helen asked if she could write a feature article. Patricia insisted on scheduling their first lesson immediately. Robert wanted to introduce her to the symphony's board of directors. Lisa answered their questions as best she could, still feeling like she was dreaming. They asked about her training, her repertoire, her influences. When she mentioned Juilliard, they nodded knowingly. When she explained why she'd left, their expressions softened with understanding rather than judgment. Eventually, they began to leave, each one pressing a business card into her hand, making her promise to follow up. Helen hugged her before she left. Patricia squeezed her shoulder and said, Welcome back. Finally, only Richard and Lisa remained in the penthouse. She sank back onto the piano bench, her legs suddenly weak. Richard poured 2 glasses of water and brought one to her. So, he said, sitting in one of the now empty chairs, still think you're too old and too unknown to make it? Lisa laughed, and then, to her surprise, she started crying. Not sad tears, but the kind that came from relief and overwhelming emotion, and the sudden release of 3 years of carrying impossibly heavy weight. Richard handed her a tissue and waited, patiently while she pulled herself together. I don't know how to thank you, she finally managed to say. You already did, Richard said simply. You proved that I was right, that you're the real thing. Now comes the hard part. What's that? Actually doing it. Building the career, facing the pressure, dealing with success, which can be just as hard as dealing with failure. He smiled. But I think you'll manage. You've survived worse. Lisa looked at the piano, then at the city spread out below the windows, then back at Richard. What if I mess this up? You won't. But even if you stumble, you'll have people supporting you now. That's what tonight was about. Not just proving your talent, but building a foundation. Richard stood up. Patricia's offer was genuine. So was Robert's. And Helen's article will reach thousands of people. You're not alone anymore. Lisa nodded, wiping away the last of her tears. She thought about her moth. You're safe at home and healthy. She thought about the 3 years that had felt like they'd stolen her dreams, and she realized that maybe those years hadn't stolen anything. Maybe they'd just delayed things while teaching her something important about strength and sacrifice and what really mattered. Okay, she said, standing up. Let's do this. Richard extended his hand and she shook it firmly. Welcome back to the music world, Lisa. They have no idea what's about to hit them. The year that followed felt like living in fast forward. Lisa kept expecting to wake up and find it had all been a dream, but each morning brought new proof that her life had fundamentally changed. Helen's article came out 2 weeks after the private concert. The headline read, The Pianist Who Disappeared and Why Her Return Matters. It ran on the front page of the arts section, complete with a photo of Lisa at Richard's piano. Helen wrote about her performance with a kind of passion that music critics usually reserved for legendary figures. She called Lisa's playing achingly beautiful and technically flawless, with a depth of emotion that can't be taught. The article went viral. Within days, Lisa's inbox was flooded with messages. Concert venues wanted to book her. Music schools asked her to give master classes. A documentary filmmaker wanted to tell her story. It was overwhelming and terrifying and exciting all at once. Patricia was true to her word about the free lessons. They met 3 times a week at the conservatory, working through repertoire, polishing technique, preparing Lisa for the spotlight that was rapidly approaching. Patricia was demanding but never cruel, pushing Lisa to reach beyond what she thought possible. "You have the talent," Patricia told her during one particularly grueling session. "Now you need the stamina." Professional musicians perform under pressure, jet-lagged, sick, emotionally drained. You have to be able to deliver excellence even when conditions aren't perfect. Lisa threw herself into the work, with an intensity that surprised even her. She quit her waitressing job, living off a modest stipend that Richard had arranged through his foundation. Every day was consumed with practice, study, preparation. Her fingers developed new calluses on top of old ones. Her back ached from hours at the piano. But she'd never been happier. Robert scheduled her debut with the symphony for 8 months after the private concert. Guest soloist for Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, the same piece that had started everything. The announcement generated immediate buzz. Tickets sold out within 48 hours. But the real turning point came 6 months in, when Michael connected her with a recording producer named Vincent. He ran a small but respected classical music label, the kind that prioritized artistic integrity over commercial success. Vincent came to hear Lisa practice and afterward sat in silence for a full minute. "I want to record an album with you," he finally said. "Full length. Your choice of repertoire. We'll do it right, take our time, no rushing." They spent 3 months in the studio, recording and re-recording until every piece was exactly as Lisa envisioned it. She chose a mix of well-known and obscure compositions, pieces that meant something to her personally. The title came to her one sleepless night. Second movement. It worked on multiple levels. The musical term, yes, but also the idea of a second chance, a second act, a second beginning. The album released 2 weeks before her symphony debut. The reviews were stunning. Major music publications praised her interpretation, her technique, her emotional depth. One reviewer wrote, "Lisa plays like someone who has lived through something profound and come out the other side with wisdom to share." Her mother came to visit the week before the big performance. She'd been doing well, her health stable, back to her old self in most ways. Lisa picked her up at the airport and drove her straight to the concert hall for a rehearsal. They sat in the empty auditorium while Lisa ran through sections with the orchestra. Afterward, her mother was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, "I'm sorry." "For what?" Lisa asked, genuinely confused. "For getting sick. For costing you those years. For taking away your chance." Lisa took her mother's hand. "Mom, you didn't take anything away. You gave me perspective. I was so focused on success back then that I'd forgotten why I loved music in the first place. Those 3 years, as hard as they were, they taught me what actually matters." Her mother's eyes filled with tears. "But you gave up so much." "I didn't give up anything," Lisa said firmly. "I hit pause, and now I'm pressing play again, but I'm a different person. A better person, I think. I play differently now. With more heart. That only happened because of what we went through together." The night of the symphony performance arrived cold and clear. Lisa stood backstage in a concert gown that Patricia had helped her pick out, listening to the orchestra warm up. She could hear the murmur of the audience through the curtain. 2,000 people out there. Critics, music lovers, industry professionals, and regular folks who just loved classical music. Richard was out there somewhere with her mother. Patricia had a seat near the front. Helen had come with her editor. Michael brought several venue directors he wanted Lisa to meet afterward. All these people who'd believed in her, who'd helped resurrect her career from the ashes. But as Lisa walked onto the stage and the applause washed over her, she realized something important. This moment wasn't really about them or even about her. It was about the music itself, about beauty surviving despite hardship, about second chances and perseverance and the stubborn refusal to let talent die just because life got difficult. She sat at the piano and nodded to Robert, who raised his baton. The orchestra began the opening, those haunting chords that introduced the piece. And then it was her turn. Lisa's hands found the keys and she began to play. The familiar notes flowed out, but they felt different here, in this hall with this orchestra, with her whole journey behind her. She wasn't the confident 22-year-old prodigy anymore. She was 28, marked by struggle, shaped by sacrifice, and somehow more complete because of it. The music built and swelled, the piano and orchestra interweaving in that gorgeous conversation that made this concerto so beloved. Lisa poured herself into every phrase, every dynamic shift, every moment of tenderness and power. She played for her mother, fighting for her life in hospital beds. She played for her younger self, full of dreams and determination. She played for everyone who'd ever had to choose between their passion and their responsibilities. The second movement, the truly slow and heartbreaking one, reduced the audience to absolute silence. Lisa could feel them hanging on every note, breathing with the music. This was what she'd lost for 3 years, and what she'd feared she'd never have again. This connection, this communication without words, this ability to make strangers feel something profound, just by pressing keys in the right order. The final movement exploded with energy and joy, a celebration of survival and triumph. The orchestra surged behind her as she drove toward the conclusion, her fingers racing across the keys, her whole body engaged with the music. The audience had disappeared. The hall had disappeared. There was only the sound and the story and the pure exhilaration of doing what she was born to do. The final chord crashed out and hung in the air. Lisa sat frozen, her hands still raised, not wanting the moment to end. Then the applause started, and it was like a dam breaking. People jumped to their feet immediately. The standing ovation went on, waves of sound washing over her. Robert turned and bowed to her, then gestured for her to stand. She rose on shaky legs and took her bow. The applause grew even louder. People were throwing flowers. Someone was shouting, "Brava!" The orchestra members were tapping their stands with their bows, the traditional musician's salute. Lisa looked out into the audience and found her mother's face. She was crying and laughing at the same time, clapping so hard it probably hurt. Next to her, Richard was beaming with obvious pride, nodding like he'd known this would happen all along. Maybe he had. The reviews the next day were even better than Lisa had dared hope. Helen wrote that the performance was transcendent and the most moving concert of the year. Other critics called it a triumph. The recording of the performance became one of the most streamed classical music pieces of the month. More offers poured in. A European tour, guest appearances with major orchestras across the country, invitations to prestigious music festivals. Lisa accepted some and declined others, careful not to burn out. Mindful of maintaining the balance she'd learned the hard way. She also made time for Richard's foundation, teaching master classes to young musicians from underprivileged backgrounds. Those sessions became some of her favorite work. She'd tell them her story, not to brag, but to show them that success wasn't always a straight line, that setbacks didn't mean failure, that sometimes the detours made you better at your destination. One student, a 15-year-old girl with fierce talent and a difficult home situation, asked Lisa what she'd learned from almost losing her dream. Lisa thought about it carefully before answering. "I learned that talent is important, but it's not everything. Resilience matters. Knowing why you do what you do matters, and understanding that success isn't just about you. It's about what you can give to others through your art." She smiled at the girl. "Also, I learned that it's never too late. People talk about windows of opportunity like they close forever, but sometimes they just close temporarily, and if you're patient and you keep working, they can open again." 3 years after that charity gala where she'd crashed and played piano, Lisa recorded her second album. It was called Full Circle, and featured some of the pieces she'd been working on when she'd left Juilliard, now played with years of additional life experience informing every note. Richard came to the recording session and watched from the control booth. During a break, Lisa joined him and they listened to the playback together. "You know what's funny?" Richard said. "I almost didn't talk to you that night. I almost just went home and forgot about it." "What changed your mind?" Lisa asked, honestly. "I couldn't stop thinking about how wrong I'd been. I'd dismissed you completely before you played, and then you proved that I'd almost missed something incredible because of my own assumptions and prejudices." He smiled. "It reminded me that real talent doesn't always come in the package you expect. Sometimes it shows up in a worn jacket at a party it wasn't invited to." Lisa laughed. "Best decision I ever made, crashing that gala. Best decision I ever made, offering to buy you dinner." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the music flowing from the speakers. Lisa's playing filled the studio, each note clear and purposeful and alive with meaning. "Thank you," Lisa said quietly, "for seeing something in me when everyone else just saw someone who didn't belong. Thank you for reminding me why I got into all of this in the first place," Richard replied. "Money's easy. Finding something meaningful to do with it, that's the challenge. Helping you get back to music, that's been the most rewarding thing I've done in years." Lisa returned to the recording studio for another take, settling onto the piano bench with the ease of someone who'd finally found their way home. As she placed her hands on the keys, she thought about how close she'd come to giving up. How many nights she'd convinced herself that her chance had passed, that she was too old, too forgotten, too far behind. But she'd been wrong. The music had been waiting for her all along. It just took a millionaire who'd thought her performance would be a joke, and a moment of courage at a charity gala to help her find her way back. The red recording light came on. Lisa took a breath, smiled, and began to play.